Architects worldwide are increasingly interested in the impact of architecture on the environment, and architectural historians have started exploring the complicity of architecture in the climate emergency. Along with that, we also need to look at past efforts by architects to mitigate the impact of architecture on the environment.
What does it mean to design for the global majority? In 2023, the Design for the Global Majority exhibitions at McGill University traced the 50 years of groundbreaking contributions of the Minimum Cost Housing Group as inspiration for contemporary architects to help us navigate our uncertain future. The Design for the Global Majority project interprets the Minimum Cost Housing Group's extensive output in 5 thematic axes: upcycle, harness, plan, leverage, and hack. The group was established at McGill University's School of Architecture in 1971 to search for architectural solutions related to housing and infrastructure in the Global South.
What we found in the work of the Minimum Cost Housing Group, that they had this ethos of experimentation, and we want to carry that to the exhibition, both in its design and conceptualization of this quite long history and diverse production.
Yeah, it was a really wonderful opportunity to develop thematically with my co-curators the ways of representing the group through these thematic axes, and then work with students to develop a display mechanism and reproductions of this archival work, and have that be kind of a coherent reflection of the ethics of minimum cost housing. To be low cost, to be do it yourself, to make do with the circumstances presented to you, and the innovation that that can lead you to in unexpected directions.
Pulling it together and telling that story in a coherent way, I think, was a very challenging but rewarding thing. That yes, it is possible for the design professionals to engage at different scales, in different locations, in resource-rich or resource-poor situations, and use those resources in the most judicious way and inform the design process in this whole journey. This is where I think the project really brings forth ideas which are useful for people in the present time, even though this is a historical storytelling of what the group was working on.
Over 5 decades under the directorship of Alvaro Ortega, Witold Rybczynski, and Vikram Bhatt, the group developed innovative architectural research, hands-on experimentation, and common-sense building solutions.
Alvaro Ortega, when he started the minimum cost housing program, he was a very seasoned professional. He had studied at McGill, at Harvard with Gropius. He had his own practice in Colombia, had built a lot of things, and he had worked for a number of years for the United Nations Center for Housing, Building and Planning. So he had seen the housing problems around the globe. So he brought a great degree of experience and a certain savoir-faire to this program in founding the program. When I arrived as a graduate student in the early 70s, Alvaro was there and Witold also was there, and there was a transition taking place. So I was fortunate to be working with, learning from, and be able to exchange ideas with both these individuals.
Building on the program's founder Alvaro Ortega's previous work as a UN advisor, the group launched with a groundbreaking idea: upcycling industrial waste into building components for low-cost housing. One key material was sulfur, a byproduct of petroleum refineries and an abundant substance in volcanic regions worldwide. Members transformed this low-cost, easily accessible material into sulfur concrete, from which they created building components such as paving blocks, bricks, tiles, and interlocking and self-aligning hollow blocks.
We didn't have courses, we didn't have seminars, we didn't have studios. I mean, we sat around talking. First of all, the first year we basically were just listening to his experiences, and then we started exploring various ideas which came from him. The sulfur concrete was an obvious one because he had seen volcanic sulfur used as a kind of building material, and he wanted to explore whether you could actually exploit volcanic sulfur, which in certain countries was like the Philippines, where we later did some work together, that was there.
They also explored sulfur as a surface bonding and waterproofing agent and put sulfur concrete to the test by building several full-scale demonstration projects.
We tested things, we measured things, because even with the sulfur concrete, we were measuring the strength of things, and so there was a kind of tradition that you never did it on paper. It had to be at least a kind of prototype.
Ecole House, built on McGill University's McDonald campus, was the group's first full-scale demonstration project made with sulfur. The influential publications The Problem Is and Ecole Operation introduced the group's mandate of developing new ways of building in ecologically responsible ways.
What I think is very groundbreaking and pioneering about the entire minimum cost housing program is that it grew out of the ecology movement, clearly, in the 1970s, and a poster like this one that says some ways of building ecologically. If you just read the first one, building with renewable resources, such as timber or vegetable fibers, which do not consume the earth's stock of non-reusable materials. All of those 12 principles are with us now in more developed ways.
The Minimum Cost Housing Group identified household challenges of water and sanitation as one of the critical problems experienced globally by people with limited means, one that remains unresolved to this day. The group tested lo-fi techniques for collecting potable water and improving hygiene and sanitation. They embraced readily available hardware and do-it-yourself assembly techniques.
I remember we used this in our own house as to experiment with it. The idea was that you pressurize it with a bicycle pump. So you put water in here, you pressurize it with a bicycle pump, and then you spray this atomized water. And it was originally an idea of Buckminster Fuller, which I think eventually made its way to NASA.
Experiments in upcycling waste as a construction material were followed by new research seeking to reduce buildings' operational and environmental costs. Many of these experiments were put to the test at the Ecole House, which attempted to resolve issues around water and power in a decentralized, small-scale, and low-cost manner. Rainwater was used for showering and hand washing, and dirty wash water was converted back into drinking water using a rooftop solar still. Electricity for radios, pumps, motors, and lights was produced by a wind machine that was installed next to the house. The group was also interested in alternative waste disposal systems.
I mean, this was an idea that Alvaro had seen these types of bathrooms in, I think, Japan, where the sink is on top of the toilet, so the gray water goes into the cistern, and then that's used for flushing. And then these were instantaneous water heaters, which is quite common in some countries at that time. Not so much here, but I think in countries where electricity was very expensive, instead of building a water heater, as we do, the cold water just goes through and it's heated immediately and you use it. There's no storage. This became the basis for the one in the Ecole, which was a working one. We cast the sink in sulfur so that it became the lid of the cistern.
The publication Stop the 5-Gallon Flush cataloged alternative waste disposal systems, focusing on ones that use little to no water, from pit latrines to chemical toilets and beyond.
You know, I remember publications like Stop the 5-Gallon Flush, that these are the issues that right now we're working in development housing in all over the world, but especially in Latin America. Those things have to do now with resilience, have to do with mitigation and with adaptation to climate change. So for me, that idea of, if you want to find solutions or appropriate solutions to the housing needs in Latin America, you should think out of the box.
It was late 70s, after or just around the time of the Habitat 1, there was a growing awareness of the kind of the global reach and implication of our programs. We were very well informed because Alvaro had already brought all the experience and know-how, and we were informed, but now there was a possibility to imagine us going and doing things globally.
The thinking at minimum cost housing was very different from what I had learned, absorbed. Here I learned that some slums are not the problem, they are the solution, which is really turned my belief system upside down, because I come from a country where slum eradication is the preferred method of dealing with slums.
The Minimum Cost Housing Group formed collaborations with global embedded institutional partners in India, China, and Mexico, among others.
So we were learning from Indonesia, we were learning from Iran, from Mexico, from Lebanon, from Syria, from India, of course, from China. And China is very important at this stage because we were doing a project, which was the Jue Hutong housing initiative, and understanding how traditional housing in Beijing was happening. In fact, over the years, as China has grown, all those developments have been submerged within the urban growth. But those traditional housing were where we learned how people were building, how people related to their spaces, how people shared spaces, including people sharing sanitation systems, which was a very interesting experience for us. And I took back all these ideas back home.
There was a component of tradition, preservation, traditional mode of living. So we were very interested in learning about the history of the old city and the way of life in the courtyard house. The traditional urban fabric was being renovated, let's say bulldozed, to make room for higher density housing. But there was also a very social problem with the relocation of millions of people to the periphery. And the intent was to try to find an alternative to courtyard housing that would offer higher quality of life, but try to keep people on the site rather than having them shipped out.
In each case, in situ research formed the basis for new urban development proposals that were responsive to the demands, desires, needs, and existing routines of users. Partnering with the Vasta Shilpa Foundation, a nonprofit founded by the late Indian architect Balkrishna Doshi, the group looked to the slums as sources of housing design principles. Group members conducted an extensive study of informal settlements in Indore in central India. They meticulously documented the activities and spatial requirements of residents, which they reported in the publication How the Other Half Builds.
The idea was to question. First thing, what was not being addressed in these projects was lifestyle of residents living in there. It was not just what you gave them on their service site, but how beyond that very small service site, the daily life of poor families was organized. This is what was always overlooked in sites and services projects. So minimum cost housing team worked in the squatter settlements in Indore and showed how the other half builds. So we carried out studies of living patterns in the informal settlements in the very same city that the new housing project was being planned.
The studies conducted by the Minimum Cost Housing Group and the Vasta Shilpa Foundation on informal settlements in the same city informed the planning approach for Balkrishna Doshi's Aranya Township project. There, the group designed a 200-dwelling proposal, which was built as part of Aranya, and conducted a post-occupancy study that analyzed how the housing has developed and adapted over time.
So my research was the documentation of the Bhadreshwar Site and Services Project. And this was a project where infrastructure was provided and people were able to buy plots of land at subsidized rates to build their own houses, ostensibly to build their own houses. So my study was an attempt to find out if the project had met its target audience and if people were in fact building their own houses and if the basic layout of the community was conducive to congenial community building.
This new way of thinking, what's the best way of housing people, how we should first learn how people live and then improve their housing or do interventions. This was really another life-altering experience for me.
The Minimum Cost Housing Group was a pioneer of urban agriculture research and implementation. Urban agriculture would improve living conditions for city inhabitants in a mutually beneficial ecological system. It would mitigate food insecurity and urban heat island effect and trap carbon dioxide from polluted city air. As early as 1974, they tested greenhouse designs. They then launched the Rooftop Wastelands project in collaboration with a community center in downtown Montreal, transforming the building's roof into a demonstration garden.
In 1974, I was a student in those days and I worked on the rooftop project. Energy crisis also was a very critical challenge. So it was not just using the roof for productive purposes, but also capturing solar energy, extending the growing season, recycling the energy which was being lost from the chimneys and so on, integrating those into the roof. So many of these ideas, which have become quite operational today, were initially tried out in Rooftop Wasteland project.
Projects such as Edible Landscape and Edible Campus explore alternative ways of approaching nature and food production in the city.
There was many funny things going on in our group, trying to learn about agriculture in Montreal. I became quite adamant about introducing new students as a teaching assistant to these concepts. But not every student or not every parent of a student, I think, were accepting of this idea that my beautiful son or daughter, trained to be an important architect, should study carrots and lettuce and these very, very ephemeral things that don't survive a very long time. But in fact, there's a long tradition in architecture about food. And we just try to make a very, very simple point that why is it illegal to grow food in the city? Why are these landscapes only made for beauty? Why shouldn't all these landscapes also be made for utility, meaning for the pleasure of eating and for the nutrition of eating it?
The Edible Campus project, for example, transformed the neglected concrete terrace surrounding McGill University's Burnside Hall into a demonstration of productive planting in the city. Partnering with Alternatives and Centre Paul Rouland's Meals on Wheels program for people with reduced mobility, the team designed and built a 120-square-meter container garden. The project continues to address food security involving the campus community in participatory cultivating.
Each picture is really brings, a fond memory. it's not just the greening of the space, and I wonder how the public sees them, because there's so many layers. So, for example, this image here is a really interesting one in a way, because we see a layout. So we wonder, what is this layout about? And what is essential to also think about when we see this layout is that it's created by the community.
Through its Edible Landscape project, the group showcased how productive planting could be integrated as a permanent feature, not only in Montreal, but also in Colombo in Sri Lanka, Kampala in Uganda, and Rosario in Argentina, while encouraging citizen participation in creating green and edible community spaces.
We had a course, it's called Urban Shelter, where course participants and the staff would visit Metro Manila, and we were working with a non-government organization called Tao Pilipinas, and they told us that they had problems in many parts of the slum areas in Metro Manila because food was really a problem. And people ended up buying trash bags from restaurant chains and then recycling, refrying or recooking the food and serve it to their families. And I was like, God, we have to really do something about it. And then I thought, why not integrate urban agriculture somehow to the planning of human settlements? We can have that topic in our curriculum. So I Googled and happened to find the publications of minimum cost housing, and it became like a gem for me. It's like a springboard for more research and learning more about what's happening, what McGill did, what minimum cost housing did in the campus. So that is really wonderful for me.
The Minimum Cost Housing Group's institutional home, McGill University, is situated on the traditional, unceded territory of the Kenyan Gehaka. Over the years, the group was invited by and has worked on problems of housing, water, and waste management with First Nations and Inuit communities living primarily in northern Ontario and Quebec, where systemic disenfranchisement and ecological degradation have deeply impacted the peoples, land, resources, and economies. Projects in Big Trout Lake, a community in northwestern Ontario, and Chisasibi, a Cree village in northern Quebec, present alternatives to top-down and conventional housing and planning. In the 2010s, the group initiated collaborative projects to rethink urbanism, infrastructure, and public space with Inuit communities in Nunavik in northern Quebec. These projects culminated in the publication Blueprint for a Hack. They adapted methods and strategies honed over the previous decades, including participatory approaches, site-specific research, and culturally sensitive design.
All the people working with Kojuak Development Authority, also working with the City Hall, and all the staff participated. Again, in the design process, we wanted to involve local people in the spaces which are being used by children, skating ring, baseball field, and others. So they work in the school to run hands-on design workshops so that young children get initiated in the design process. And those ideas we again flushed out in the town hall at the end of the day, where the city staff came and other people participated. And it is this kind of synergy of all people, all hands on board, contributing, and it was their project, and were able to achieve this in a week.
The hack, connotating a do-it-yourself, improvisational, and low-cost solution-oriented approach, responds to the rich building culture already used by the Inuit throughout northern Canada.
Vikram and I think Witold Rybczynski and Alvaro, they all had their feet planted firmly in working with communities, and that was what was radical. And now I think 40 years later, many of the schools' hands-on learning in Indigenous communities has come back into our curriculums, working with communities and getting students to go out and get field experience rather than sit abstractly at a desk and kind of project architectural ideas on the world. That has all come, I would say, from my perspective in teaching, it's come full circle, but it started with programs like this.
The other things that I learned from, or I consider a valuable thing from the minimum cost housing, was the approach there was a research-based education, but with an extremely, I would say, thinking out of the box approach. They were doing extraordinary things that when you look back now, you could tell that they were such ahead of their time.
To learn from a diversity, I think that was the strongest part of this program, that we had people from so many different societies and cultures, and you could understand and learn. And I think in this world today, this globalized world today, which is so full of strife and stress, this is the most important thing, to know and understand and respect cultures and ways of living from across. And I think that's what the minimum cost housing gave me, that foundation. Yeah.
How do we look at cities? This is the question. What can you do as an individual, as a designer? How we make a small house more efficient will have a big impact on the performance of the neighborhood. What's a good livable neighborhood? What's a walkable neighborhood? To what this impact the city and building industry has on our global environment. In the story of minimum cost, we had multiple clients, but one of the most important clients for us was the global majority. Certainly, majority of the humanity now lives in cities. So this is where the challenges are.